Hey guys, it's Kristen here, and I am super pumped to talk to Katie McCoy today about a topic that we've never talked about here on the Girldefined show, that we've never really taken a deep dive on in any aspects here at Girldefined. And it's this whole idea of, as modern women, our understanding and perspective of what God says about women, specifically in the Old Testament, and a lot of the Old Testament laws that I know many of us find confusing. I've talked to many of you who feel like, well, is God sexist? Like, I relate to Jesus more. I feel like he loves women, but I don't know about the God of the Old Testament. And so we have an expert on today to help us as Christian women gain confidence that God loves women, the God of the Old Testament, Jesus that we see in the New Testament, that he is for women, that he has a beautiful plan for women, that he loves us. And understanding that, I think, will be so helpful for all of us. For one, just to answer a lot of the questions that we have, the confusion that we have around this. I think this is going to strengthen our faith as Christian women living today to understand the context and the culture of what was happening in the Old Testament. And then when those questions pop up in your mind, when you read something confusing and you're like, wait a minute, I don't get what's happening here. Hopefully this conversation will help you gain a filter for which you can say, okay, yeah, but culturally what was happening? And you can dig a little bit deeper and see God's heart behind what was going on at the time. So Katie, thank you for having this huge conversation with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen. This is so fun. And it's always amazing to meet other warrior women who want to dive into this. This is not for the faint of heart.
This is not for the faint of heart, which is why I'm glad you are the one that's going to be teaching us today, because this does feel kind of overwhelming to me. Like, I'll be honest, I feel it just feels daunting. Like, where do you even start? There are so many different passages. So I'm just curious, how did you personally get into studying this whole idea of Old Testament laws for women?
I fell into it because
Really?
I was in my doctoral research and I had to pick a dissertation, and I got to teach these passages to some student wives at the seminary where I was teaching, and it was really fun because just realizing the light bulb goes off when we realize what these laws meant to women in the cultural context in which they were given. And as I looked into it, I thought, it's so funny. You've only got feminists and rabbis talking about these laws, and they obviously come at it from very different perspectives, very different vantage points. And then they come to very different conclusions. But there wasn't a Christian understanding of how do we understand these laws in light of not only who God is in both the Old and New Testament, but then really our theology of what it means to be human. And certainly doctrine of humanity, doctrine of the differences between men and women. That's something that we're kind of forever looking at in our day and age. That's kind of the doctrine that most of the issues that are happening in our culture is swirling around. But I love how you introduced this topic, because I think that the first challenge we come to is, who is this God of the Old Testament? And whether or not we realize it, we often separate them and forget that we're talking about one God. It's not that God is mad in the Old Testament and then merciful in the New. No, his character is all throughout the Old Testament consistently. And one of the things we typically do, especially if you've been doing any kind of like read through the Bible in a year, you get to Leviticus and one of two things happens. We power through it. We power through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we'll just say one of two things. Wow, this seems incredibly unfair, misogynistic. Who is this God of the Old Testament? And then maybe if we're in a more generous perspective, we might say, oh, thank you, God, that we are not under the law and none of this matters for us now. That's only partly true, because while we are not under the law in the sense of we are no longer being judged by the law because Jesus has fulfilled that on our behalf, he fulfilled it on our behalf so that Romans 8 tells us we are now free to fulfill the whole point of the law. And then we get that on later on in Romans. So in other words, we don't just chuck the law, we fulfill it. Well, now what does that mean for us? If we are now free to fulfill the law of God, we at least need to know what it says, right? We at least need to understand the principles and the character of God that he is communicating through his law. And if Jesus himself was the fulfillment of the law, that means that, at least on some level, even though we're not under the ceremonial requirements, we're not under the sacrificial system, we're not judged by it in the sense that we are now judged by how we keep it in our standing with God. Praise Jesus for that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. So now what do we do with the law of God in our Christian lives?
Yeah. You had mentioned that feminists and rabbis are the only ones talking about it. And I actually pulled up some comments, and I would love to hear your feedback on these from some feminists of what they're saying. And I think that some Christian women might even say, yeah, I kind of relate to that. I kind of feel that too. So one commented online, the Bible is not truth. It's written from a man, and frankly, more from the devil than anything. Back in the day, men used women as sex slaves and owned them. That's when the Bible was written, and I don't understand why people are blindly following it. Another feminist commented, the Bible is clearly structurally misogynistic. This is a major reason I think us feminists need to reject Christianity outright rather than attempt to reform Christianity from within. It's dishonest to downplay these verses, and there were a whole bunch of verses from the Old Testament listed when they are central to the entire text. So what would you say in response to comments like that?
First of all, I want those comments, Kristen. You got to send those to me. That is amazing, because it is such a snapshot of what people are feeling. And I honestly have to appreciate the courage to say it out loud, because a lot of times we read these passages and we might feel that, but we go, oh, I can't dare think that. And so unfortunately, we just never address it. We never look at our own assumptions. So first of all, what we need to go back to the very beginning is, what is a legal code? Any legal code, any legal system is the expression of a value system. So when you are encountering the law of God, you are encountering God's value system the same way that when you look at our American laws, you are looking at our American value system, what we punish, what we praise, what we would reward, and then what we would penalize. And so when you encounter the law of God, you are encountering his value system. So for instance, if I were queen and I said, every Friday, everybody has to eat chocolate cake, you would understand from that I really value chocolate cake, to the point that I have now made it a law. And so what
sounds like a pretty good one to me.
Oh yeah,
actually.
exactly, right? Who would not want to live in my kingdom? So whenever we are encountering laws, we're encountering a value system. Now, we have to understand, when we're encountering the value system of God, that we are encountering it not in the modern West, which values individualism, that has a very different framework for how we organize and order society, but rather we are encountering the law of God in an ancient Near Eastern patriarchal or patricentric culture. Before your eyes glaze over, let's talk about those words. Patriarchy, according to feminist interpreters, and really this is probably very mainstream, is the root of all problems of the female experience. And so everything that you could find wrong with women's lives, you could boil it down to the patriarchy. The only thing you do is smash the patriarchy, get rid of the patriarchy.
Right.
And so the patriarchy, quote unquote, is properly understood. It's father rule or male rule. Some people have said it's not actually fair to call the Bible patriarchal, that it's patricentric. Now, that might not sound like a big bump up, but what they mean by that is that society revolved around fathers in a structural and organizational sense. So unlike our lives today, where we have local government, state government, federal government, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, your local government was families, clans, tribes. And these families, clans, and tribes were organized, and the sort of rule of those was fathers and husbands. Now, we have cultural lenses when we are reading that. And
Mm-hmm.
I would even say we have cultural bias. Now, we talk a lot about cultural bias in our culture today, things that we're very aware, usually, of how our own background can skew or slant our interpretation of events, of things that are happening right here in the middle of our lives, living in the same country, in the same era. Well, how much more might we have cultural bias when we are trying to interpret a legal text
Yeah.
from thousands of years ago in a completely different culture?
So
Well,
true.
right away, we have to recognize that the lenses that we are coming to the Bible with may not be the right interpretive lens to understand what it meant to them at the time that it was written. One of the things that we miss when we're hearing a lot of interpreters who would just say the Bible is hopelessly misogynistic, it's irredeemable. I remember hearing one
Mm-hmm.
feminist say, is it presumes that the interpreter's culture is superior to the culture of scriptures. Now,
Interesting.
we don't have to necessarily prove one way or the other, right? We don't have to say, well, which culture is morally superior. Let's just take a step back. Despite all of our educational and technological advances, are we better human beings than the types of human beings that we find in the Bible or any other point in history? Well, our Bibles would tell us no. Our Bibles would tell us that our hearts are still just as corrupt. If the problem of the human condition was one of education, then you would think we would be some of the most moral versions of humanity that we've ever seen. And yet we don't have that even in our modern American West. If the
Hmm.
problem was exclusively the development of society or information or technology, we have we're in the technological age, and yet we find twofold people using the innovation of humanity to alleviate human suffering, and then we also find people finding new ways to exploit other human beings in ways that weren't even
Mm-hmm.
possible. So in other words, if the problem of the human condition is inward corruption, and that's what scripture tells us is true, then we can't say that we have a morally superior culture to that of people in the Bible. We have a very different culture. We have a very
Mm-hmm.
different set of values. We have a very different way of organizing our understanding of an individual and society and how an individual relates to and has responsibilities in society. But we can't say that we are automatically so morally advanced that we
Hmm.
can judge the culture of the Bible and we can determine whether it is true.
That's so interesting. It's like you've got to back up and take it from that vantage point first, and then you can step forward. So help us understand, because it is confusing. We don't live back then. We don't live in that culture. We are very far removed from that here in the West, for most of us. So what was it like back then for women in the Old Testament culture? Can you give us paint a picture of what life was like in that society?
Yes. So the biggest difference compared to our culture today is
Mm-hmm.
that everyone lived in what's called a collectivist society. Now, there are still cultures in the world today that are collectivistic,
Yeah.
but what that means is that your highest goal, your greatest good, was to fulfill your responsibilities to your family and your community. We live in an individualistic culture where your
Mm-hmm.
highest good is to chart your own course, pave your own way. In fact, the one who does that, we valorize that person. They are courageous, they are being true to themselves. And then, because we're Americans, we are super individualistic. We
Mm-hmm.
don't look at the things that come before as the model for how we should do them. We are mold breakers, for better or for worse, mostly for better. Because from America, you have all of the ways that people are able to come with nothing and turn their lives around. If we had a culture that just was looking to the past to shape our future, we would be like most of Europe. So there's positive and negative with that as well. But then we also live in the 21st century American West that says who you are is who you feel yourself to be. And no
Mm-hmm.
one has the right to disagree with that. In fact, if they do, they're trying to force you into a very hypocritical life. So you can imagine right away the clash that
Yeah.
we have with a collectivistic culture. So, perfect example, imagine with me that I am the daughter of first generation immigrants. So I'm the daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation. I've been a naturalized American. So I came from another country with my parents, and I have grown up here. And my parents, starting with nothing, built a business from scratch. And they built this business from scratch not only so that they would be able to contribute to society, they would be able to build up their lives, change their family tree, but they would be able to pass that business on to me in their old age. And I, in turn, would take that business, provide for my family, and be able to provide for them in their old age. There's just one problem, Kristen. I want to be a Broadway actress. In fact, this is my biggest dream. I want to be a Broadway
Mm.
actress and make it on the Great White Way. And I want to throw off all of these expectations from my family, all
Mhm.
of these cultural assumptions that I will take their business and continue to grow it, benefiting my family and my parents. Now, which one are you rooting for? Not which one
Mm.
do you think is the prudent or reasonable or responsible thing to do, but which one are you really kind of rooting for?
Right.
Well, depending on your answer, that likely shows whether you are from an individualistic or a collectivistic culture. The individualist would
Interesting.
say, go for your dream,
Mhm.
live out your deepest passions, right? A collectivist would say it would be a great dishonor to you, a great shame to you, if you were to just rebuff and abandon all of your family responsibilities to just do what you want. It's selfish. Now, right there, we have a major clash in how we
Mhm.
interpret the Bible. And just looking at the few minutes we've spent on that, we can see how picking up Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy from the culture that we have, we are already slanted to see it in a way that is
Mhm.
different from how it actually worked out in the times of the lives to whom it was given.
That's so interesting. Okay, so unpack, what was it like for the women back then in that culture?
So it was not only collectivistic, it was agrarian, meaning that everything revolved around crops. Typically, you certainly
Mhm.
had marketplace, but it revolved around crops, and everybody was pitching in to the collective success of essentially the family business. Women had a arduous life, just as arduous as men did, but they also were expected to have things that were great skills. So, for instance, making clothes, they were expected to be able to deal
Mm.
with things that were technological advances. In the day, they were making food, making really the household run. And one of the things that is a misconception is that if a man had rule over his house and a patriarch both represented his family, perhaps in court, certainly in religious activities, and he was responsible for those under his care, well, that greater right always came with greater responsibility. Excuse me. That doesn't mean women did not have agency. That doesn't mean women didn't have choice or they didn't have their own ability to make decisions, even in business. You know, the Proverbs 31 woman is a woman who invests in land, creates things, sells them. And we do not see that her
Mhm.
husband was running or managing the business. Now, it could sound from modern ears that I'm saying, "Whoa, is Katie saying some kind of feministic interpretation of Proverbs 31?" No, what I'm actually describing is the mutual beneficial activities that both men and women
Mm.
had to contribute to the family. There wasn't this sense that the woman is going to go off and do her own thing and build her own brand and be like kind of hashtag girl boss. Rather, she was doing all of these activities to benefit her family. In the same way that a man was engaging in the public square, he was managing his crops, he was managing his household, which included his family, his servants, anyone traveling and staying at his house. He was doing all of that for the benefit of his family. One more thing to know that's so different from our life today. People in the Bible lived in something called an honor shame culture. An honor shame culture meant that when you committed an infraction against the community and then certainly against God's law, that you were excluded from the community. So it wasn't just a matter of having to, in our culture, we live in a guilt innocence culture where you commit an infraction, you have to pay that back, either make restitution financially or with time, like we have in our prison system. But in an honor shame culture, you were excluded from being part of the community. That meant that when you were restored to a place of honor, you were restored to the community. The way all of that works out in everyday life is that people are operating and making decisions based on what is not only in the best interest of their family, but what is retaining honor. So, for instance, sexual laws were not just about individual morality, but about the honor of the family. So when a woman committed a sexual indiscretion, it wasn't just a penalty against her for her moral choices. It was also a penalty of the shame that she brought on her family as a result of that indiscretion. But that shame was also something that her father would have felt as well, because her father was put to shame for not managing or being responsible enough for the women under his care to allow something like this to have occurred. Again, it sounds so foreign to our ears. It sounds so foreign to our ears because we live in such an individualistic society where it just wouldn't occur to us that our family might be embarrassed by something, but our choices are our own. And it's almost a bit offensive that our choices would affect the reputations of other people. But again, this is the difference between our individualistic culture, which is guilt and innocence, and the honor shame culture, which is a collectivistic one.
Do you think, in your opinion, and we're going to get into some specifics here in a minute, but do you think women who lived back then in Old Testament Israel, do you think they felt oppressed? Or do you think they felt like they were in a thriving community?
That is an excellent question, because underneath the question of, is patriarchy oppressive? I think driving that, we would have to say it depends. Because I think whether patriarchy was oppressive depends on whether a patriarch oppressed the women under his care and for which he was responsible. And keep in mind, in an honor shame culture, that would have been a source of shame to that man. So here are a few examples where I think we can't necessarily say. First, Hannah. You have in Hannah, beautiful story of persistent prayer for the desires of her heart. She didn't need a son for her financial and social stability. That's something that was actually quite rare then. And we see with Hannah a couple of things. I believe she names Samuel and she dedicates him without consulting her husband. That's quite an act of agency for the future of the family, really the heir of the first wife. And she dedicates this heir of her husband to the service of the Lord. Here's another one, Abigail. Phenomenal. I think Abigail is probably my favorite woman in scripture. You see Abigail taking significant agency. She intervened. She mobilized her household. They all listened to and obeyed her. We don't see that she was punished by her husband. We see that her husband, from the sound of it, had some kind of stroke or a heart attack or something.
Mm-hmm.
So Abigail has significant agency as well. And then I would also add, you look at the beginning of Judges. Now, Judges is a fascinating book because it chronicles the correlation when a culture turns away from God. You find that the vulnerable in that culture are more and more exploited. So by the end of Judges, of course, we know the story of the unnamed concubine and how just horrifically assaulted she was. That's an intentional tool by the narrator, by the way. It's unlikely that they didn't know who she was. It's certainly unlikely that they didn't know who the Levite was that was her legal husband. So there are these ambiguous details intentionally, because contrast that with Judges 1. In Judges 1, we have Caleb's daughter, Aksah, who has a name, has personal agency, has, we might say, lines in the script. We have a quote from her, and we have her basically negotiating her own dowry for a higher value. So she's essentially doing a business deal with her dad, saying, okay, I'm going to marry the man that I believe it's that Caleb said, anyone who takes this kind of military conquest gets my daughter. Again, that's honor. That's a matter of honor. So not only would they have the honor of marrying Caleb's daughter, she would have been honored by marrying a warrior, essentially, someone who also would have had very high standing in the community. And as a result, in her dowry, she says, don't give me just this land, give me the land where there was water connected to it. So in other words, valuable land, especially in an agrarian culture. She's the one who initiates that conversation. She's the one who asks for it. She's the one with the savvy enough to identify the value of it, and her father grants it. So we have, I think, like any other society, the answer, it depends. Are women less oppressed because they live in a democratic republic? Well, it depends, because for quite a while they didn't have the vote. For quite a while, marital rape was not acknowledged as a crime. For quite a while, if they were being domestically abused, their husband was beating them, they could leave with the clothes on their back and have no access to their children, and certainly a lack of parity in divorce laws. So does the social structure automatically lead to women's freedom and value or oppression? I think it can, but I think it depends. And so I think we have to be careful when we automatically read into the biblical culture in the same way that we have to be careful saying that here we live in a democratic republic, and yet women are still mistreated, oppressed, sexual slaves. That happens in every major city, right under our noses.
Yeah.
So we can't automatically say that because women have access to property, the vote, business, they can run for any office, that women are automatically better off.
What would you say are some of the most misunderstood Old Testament passages or laws for us as women today, reading the Bible, looking at the Old Testament, and we initially have that gut reaction of like that knee-jerk reaction, like this is oppressive to women, this is sexist, but you would argue that it's not. So give us like maybe the top 3, starting with the biggest.
I think the one that comes to mind is the childbirth law in Leviticus 12, where it looks like God is punishing her for having a girl, or at least Moses is punishing her for having a girl. I get into this teaser, by the way, Kristen, your listeners are going to be one of the few people that get this info early. I am working on a book called God, Women, and Justice, and we are going through all of these laws in detail. And so,
oh my goodness, that sounds amazing.
If you listen to this and you're like, I need more, I got you, girl. It's coming out. It's coming out. Scheduled to come in. I think it's going to be like September 2025. So I'm gonna be cranking this
Ooh.
manuscript out this summer. It's going to be. I'm very excited about it. But
Oh, I
the
can't wait.
childbirth law of Leviticus 12, it looks really does look like God is punishing her for having a girl because she has a time of purification that is double what she would have had if she'd had a boy. But again, what we miss, and this is just a real flyover view of it, is first of all, a woman who had a time of purification, you think about what that meant practically. It meant that she had the option of isolation. She wasn't isolated, but she could just stay at home. It meant that she was forbidden from going to the temple, which means she was forbidden from having to do this long walk to the temple or be on a donkey right after having given birth. It also meant that her husband could not have sex with her until her time of purification ended. Now, for a boy, if a boy was born, that all added up to 40 days. Guess what modern OBGYNs say women need after giving birth for their system to fully flush out all the bacteria, for her uterus to go back into place? They need 6 weeks, 42 days. So
Wow.
here we have ancient law ensuring that women have a time of physical rest and their reproductive systems to fully heal before resuming sexual relations. And that, by the way, would have also helped lessen the risk of sexually transmitted infections, bacteria, things for which they did not have modern medicine. This is certainly before antibiotics. And then a girl for that double time of purification. I don't want to give it all away. You'll have to get the book when it comes out. But at least for the double time of purification, what we have for women having 80 days instead of 40, they have an additional 40 days of rest. They have an additional 40 days of the entire community recognizing she's not supposed to be as active as she ordinarily would be. She's not supposed to be out and about. She's probably going to need a little more help. So you see that when you look at this from the vantage point of divinely instated maternity leave, I think it takes on a different tone, a different
Yeah.
perspective for the woman who had just given birth. And I mean, can you imagine giving birth in an
Yeah.
ancient Near Eastern culture? I mean, no modern medical, certainly no epidural, nothing. Um, I don't think they even did water births back then. So, like, it was you and a midwife and a
Mm.
birthing stool, right? So,
Hmm.
the time of recovery, an extra 40 days, I don't know that women would have really uh, uh, been complaining about that. So, that's
Hmm.
the biggest one that comes to
That
mind.
is, yes. I was going to ask you about cleanliness laws if we didn't get to it, purification laws and
Yes,
women being unclean, because I hear that a lot. But the way that you explained it, it just reframes something that we would initially look at and say, well, that seems unfair. That seems cruel, like a punishment. But then you dig deeper culturally and you realize that was actually God's way of helping women and protecting them and
right.
giving them a chance to rest and refresh and just nourish, like focus on their bodies and their baby.
Exactly.
It's the opposite of what we initially think it is.
Yes, exactly. And you think about today, women who have a child in a hospital, and then it's like, okay, you got 24 hours. and,
Yeah.
and what is the number one factor in a woman developing postpartum depression? Typically, it's fatigue. It's extreme fatigue. She
Hmm.
needs to rest. She needs other people to help her. And so when you have a culture where that rest is a societal expectation, when you also have a culture in which there are large families, clans, and tribes that all live within close proximity, that means that a woman's first 40 to 80 days, she's not going to be doing that alone. She's got help. And I think that's fun. I just find that
Yeah.
such a diametrically different perspective today. You mentioned the purity laws. So that would be number 2, misunderstood. And it's
Mm.
period laws of Leviticus 19. And it looks like God is punishing a woman for having her period. The truth is, that's simply not true. Ceremonial cleanness doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. And that's another misunderstanding. In our culture today, we think if you're unclean, you're excluded from something, well, you must be guilty, you're being punished. But in
Exactly.
reality, it was an entire system of cleanliness, of holiness, and the theological, the God-centered reason behind all of that being that we don't get to come to God however we want to on our terms. See, all of those laws were also reinforcing to the people of Israel that we come to God on His
Mm.
terms. We come to God His way. And so God had every right to say that He wanted to keep reproductive flows separate from someone coming into the temple. Now, when you later read in the prophets about how the Israelites were taking on the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, which included sexual activity in the temple prostitution, you
Hmm.
understand why the Lord was saying all sexual activity within marriage, it's no one's being punished for it. A husband and wife are not being punished if they had sex that day. What they do have to do, however, is stay away from the temple, because that would mean if they had intercourse, it meant that they were
Mhm.
ceremonially unclean. They could not come to the temple for a 24-hour period. And again, all of that, it's teaching God's people. You're seeing God's value system on display. He's saying, here's how my people will be holy or set apart
Hmm.
from every other nation. So all of these things work together
Yeah.
to communicate God's value system. And because God's law is good, I believe it benefited women who were following
Hmm.
it.
Okay, give us one more. This is so good.
One more. Okay. Now, a bit of a trigger warning for this. We won't get into all of the laws on sexual assault in Deuteronomy 22. And I want to make sure your listeners know we'll talk about something sensitive for the next couple minutes. You can make space for that. So the one of the most misunderstood, let me start this sentence over. One of the most misunderstood laws is Deuteronomy 22, verses 27 through 29. And the appearance of that law seems as though God is forcing a woman to marry her rapist. And he's forcing a woman to marry her rapist because she wasn't engaged. And so no one had sex with her. And so this man did. And now, whether she likes it or not, whether she's traumatized or not, she has to marry him. There's one big problem with that argument. The words that are used in that law do not mean a sexual assault. We know that because the previous law in verses 25 through 27 actually do describe a sexual assault. So Moses, and keep in mind, if we're believing that the Bible is God's word and the
Mhm.
Holy Spirit gave his prophets and apostles the exact words, Moses used 2 different verbs in 2 different laws that were right next to each other, literally the next sentence, describing a situation that the woman was dishonored. She was shamed because this man did not go about it the right way. But it does not mean, we can't necessarily say at least that it means that she was forced or sexually assaulted. In
Hmm.
fact, there's a little detail, and one rabbi brought this up. It says they are discovered. So this unbetrothed woman, the man sort of seduces her, persuades her, prevails upon her, and they are discovered. Well, in the law that's describing a clear sexual assault, there's no they. There is the assailant, the attacker, and the survivor. And that law, by the way, sides unequivocally with the survivor, with the girl. It
Hmm.
actually, God's law places rape on par in terms of its severity with
Hmm.
murder. And it punishes the rapist the same way that it punishes the murderer. That's
Hmm.
something that modern Western law
Hmm.
hasn't done until the last 100 to 150 years. And
Hmm.
so what is a misunderstanding is, and a lot of it's caused because our English translations don't capture the Hebrew accurately. It
Yeah.
makes it seem as though God's requiring a woman to marry her rapist, and it's not true, because according to this legal structure that we have, and keep in mind we're reading a legal document that may not necessarily cover all the details, but it's giving us patterns. But according
Hmm.
to the legal document that we have, this is not describing a rape.
Wow. This is fascinating. Okay, I wish your book was coming out this year. Now
I
we have to wait
know,
a
me
whole
too.
year. That is so interesting, and there are a million more laws and questions, but we're almost out of time. But can you just, as we wrap it up, to help us as 21st century Christian women living today, just give us a snapshot, overarching theme of how God's laws in the Old Testament are for women and just show His love and care for them?
Yes. God's law vindicates and protects vulnerable women.
Hmm.
And in cases where a woman has been wronged, harmed, or exploited, it prevents his people from ignoring it, and it prevents his people from allowing her to be further exploited. So, the more vulnerable a woman is, the more protections she actually has, down to laws
Hmm.
about if a man divorces his wife, she marries someone else, and then that man dies or divorces her, she can't go back to her first husband. The idea being you can't just pass a woman around. She's not an
Hmm.
object. One of the most staggering laws occurs in Deuteronomy, I believe it's 20 or 21, where a woman who is taken captive when God's people take the land from these pagans, it outlaws sexual slavery. In other words, there is no category for sexual slavery in God's law. Wherever there was a sexual relationship, there was the expectation of marriage. And with
Hmm.
marriage, that means that that woman had all of the rights and privileges of an Israelite wife, even if she was a pagan, even if she
Hmm.
didn't speak the language, even if she didn't even worship the God of Israel, she still had rights, not because of her social status, not because of her gender, but because God made her. And it is absolutely breathtaking when we see how these laws compare to laws even thousands of years later that do not afford women the same dignity under the law. There are places today, Kristen, where women do not have the same legal dignity and rights as they would have in
Hmm.
ancient Israelite culture. I think about women under Sharia law today,
Yeah.
where just the suspicion of adultery can get her stoned. There's a law actually protecting women from being under mob rule and suspicion from a jealous husband or rumors in the community. And essentially, what we see is that if God's law reflects his character, God's law is demonstrating his protection for the vulnerable among his people,
Yeah.
and also demonstrating the expectation of how his people would care for the vulnerable among them.
Hmm. How can we as women today, studying the Bible, how can we grow in our understanding of God's heart for women outside of reading your book right now? How can we grow in our understanding of God's heart for women in the Old Testament?
First would be, so take everything that we've talked about and
Yeah.
then go back and read some of those passages and ask yourself, okay, if I were living in this time, what would this have meant for how I live?
Hmm.
How would this have affected me? So, for instance, the childbirth laws. Imagine, okay, so what was your experience like after you'd had a baby? What was that like? Okay, how would it have been like if you were an ancient Israelite woman with no modern medical technologies or treatments. So, what would that experience have been like for you? And then ask yourself, okay, so can I say that this is automatically harmful, oppressive, um, uh, insulting to women? Or can I see where it might have actually benefited them when I understand it in context?
Hmm.
So I would say the first thing to do, go back and read these scriptures with curiosity, with an open mind and curiosity. And that's hard to do because we all come to the Bible with our own frameworks, and we all come to the
Yeah.
Bible with our own perspectives. That's not bad, that's human. The key is, do we understand those perspectives and how they are influencing, or in some cases, skewing our understanding of the Bible?
Hmm.
So go back after having heard this, and go back and read with a curious mind, not one that is looking for where does this denigrate women or prove my
Hmm.
suspicions, but with a curious heart that says, if this law reflects God, and I know God is good, how can I find what is good in this law?
Hmm. That's so good. Katie, thank you so much for
Thank
sharing this with
you.
us. I feel like I am learning so much, and just, I want to go now to the Old Testament and look up all those passages with that
Oh,
curious
good.
mind through the lens of God being a good God, and just, yeah, see them differently. This has just been so helpful. Now, I know you already have one book that's out, To Be a
Yes.
Woman. Is that
To
right?
be.
Okay, To Be a
Yes.
Woman, the confusion over female identity and how Christians can respond. So, if our community, if you're listening and you're like, I want more from Katie right now, well, you can go order that. I believe it's on Amazon and everywhere where books are sold, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so they can get their hands on that, and then we'll all have to wait patiently for your book. But I'll be praying for you, because that
Thank
is
you.
what a unique resource that is so needed and unlike anything else I've ever seen. But I know writing a book is a daunting task as well. So I'll be praying
Yes.
for you as you embark
Thank
on that
you.
journey. Yes, but thank you so much for being with us here today. This has been so awesome.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen.